Roguelikes have become a staple of the indie gaming market, with titles like The Binding of Isaac, Enter the Gungeon, and Slay the Spire gaining massive popularity due to the inherent replayability that comes with randomly generated levels, alongside the bite-sized nature of self-contained play sessions that allow you to just pick up and play. And even then, many games take that randomness factor and incorporate it into other types of games in an attempt to make the best of both worlds. Games like Chasm, Darkest Dungeon, and XCOM all do this, even though I wouldn't call them roguelikes. Hell, even Stardew Valley has roguelike elements in its mining system. But for the purposes of this video, I want to strictly talk about roguelikes and roguelites. A lot of people use the two terms interchangeably, while others have strict definitions as for what counts as each. I personally view it as a bit of a spectrum, but again, that's not entirely relevant for what I want to do here. They do have similarities and do fit under the same core ideas. So to put it simply, here's what I consider a must for a roguelike or roguelite, at least for the purposes of this video. Procedurally generated levels. While individual rooms or sections can be handcrafted, the overall level design must be randomized. Permadeath. When you die, the run is over and you must start a new run to keep going. A change in layout with each new run. Namely, the procedural generation needs to be different every time you die. This is to exclude games like Chasm or Cadence of Hyrule, which simply generate everything when you start the game and then it stays the same until you beat it. Okay, so now that we know what type of game we're talking about, let's get into the actual topic of discussion here, permanent progression and how it fits into the genre. This is a pretty hotly debated topic, with some of the hardcore purists believing the genre should stay like its namesake Rogue, where absolutely nothing carries over except the player's knowledge and skill, while others think there should be continual progress and upgrades to keep the player invested and to prevent demotivation or burnout. In general, there are three broad design philosophies at play with this type of game, with some overlap, and all have produced solid games. I'd like to take a bit of time to look at each one and discuss their strengths and weaknesses. I'll be giving each of these philosophies names, but that's just so I can organize my own thoughts. To my knowledge, there isn't any actual terminology for any of this. The first philosophy is that of the purists. In short, nothing carries over between runs. The way you get further and further in the game is through experience and practice. Spelunky is probably the most prominent example of this, at least in the modern era of gaming. Spelunky has you exploring these large 2D caves filled with hazards and enemies. When you die, you go back to the start and have to begin again from square one. Throughout the course of the game, you can actually unlock shortcuts which allow you to immediately skip to later sections of the game. This may seem like a complete subversion of the purist mentality, but I'd actually strongly disagree. Taking these shortcuts, believe it or not, is extremely suboptimal. This is because in doing so, you forego all the items and resources you can acquire early on in a run, putting you at a hefty disadvantage. I personally believe that these shortcuts are designed for people who want to practice and learn the hazards and enemies of later stages without having to go through the early stages every single time when you're only looking for practice, rather than making a serious attempt to actually beat the game. In that way, I think these shortcuts still align with the spirit of the purist mentality. Now, the main upside to this design philosophy is the emphasis and push for the player to improve on their skills and knowledge of the game. Rather than having an easy out, the player must learn the game and figure out how to adapt to all the obstacles in their path. And when you overcome those obstacles purely due to your own dedication and skill, that's one of the best feelings you can have in gaming. It's that feeling of, I did it, nobody else, me. Just like finishing a big project you've been working on or mastering a new skill, it feels good to finally finish a long journey and bask in that well-earned accomplishment. On the other hand, the main downsides to this philosophy are inaccessibility and what I like to call progress hurdles. Let's first look at inaccessibility. Now, let me be perfectly clear. I do not believe that a game being inaccessible is inherently a bad thing. Some games are simply designed for certain types of gamers, and by necessity, that will exclude others. But I find that purist-style roguelikes can be restrictive to an unnecessary degree. Purist roguelikes tend to be aimed at the more hardcore fans of the genre, so it makes sense, but at the same time, I think it can be very off-putting to someone who's interested in the genre, but hasn't quite developed a super high level of knowledge and experience yet, and it is a tough thing to balance. You can't be too ludicrously difficult right at the start, because even the most die-hard roguelike fans won't want to bother. But if you make it too easy at the start, the early portion of each run becomes boring as the player gets more skilled. So that makes it tough to properly balance a purist roguelike, considering how every player will be at a different skill level and you really don't want to turn away either end of the spectrum if you can help it. The other issue is what I call progress hurdles. In the past, I've discussed how continual progress is a concept that can keep players engaged and invested in a game, even if it's ultimately superficial. Hell, that's why things like achievements and unlocks exist at all. In most purist roguelikes, the only real mark of progress is beating the game. Even making it to a new area doesn't quite feel like a big milestone because if you die, you still fail the one objective you were given, which is to beat the game. Now for some, this is no issue whatsoever. Some people just have that built-in determination that I personally find very respectable, but many others don't have this unless they fall head over heels in love with the core gameplay loop. So after a while, if they continually fail to make what feels like real progress, it can drive them to quit the game when having something more tangible to work towards, or even to have multiple objectives along the way, could have kept up that motivation. Overall, I'd say purist roguelikes are great for the most hardcore gamers out there, but it doesn't surprise me that they're becoming less and less common as time goes on. The next philosophy is all about unlockable variety, and for the sake of ease, I'm just going to be calling these variety roguelikes from here on out. Variety roguelikes work in a way that you unlock things that alter your gameplay but don't necessarily act as a strict upgrade. Games with this mentality can fall closer to the purist side or to the more upgradey side of things. Basically, this category is pretty broad, but there wasn't a solid enough divide for me to separate it into multiple categories. On the more hardcore side of things, you have games like Nuclear Throne, where you can unlock different characters who each have unique passive and active abilities. For example, Fish has more ammo pickups and has a dodge roll, while Robot is more likely to find better weapons and can eat weapons to regain health or ammo. You can also unlock crowns for each character, all of which have an upside and a downside, like the Crown of Guns, which significantly increases the rate at which enemies drop weapons at the cost of disabling ammo drops. Or the Crown of Haste, which makes it so all pickups are worth more but they despawn faster than usual. I wouldn't say these really amount to character upgrades as much as they simply give you a new way to play. Hell, some of the crowns you get way further on I'd argue make the game objectively harder. On the other side of things, you have games like The Binding of Isaac. Here you unlock a variety of different items, many of which will provide some sort of wacky effect. Unlocking some of these items is a strict upgrade because they're really good, but overall, unlocking shit just makes it so more kinds of stuff can show up in your games. And like Nuclear Throne, there are also a variety of unlockable characters who all play a little differently from one another. The main upside to variety roguelikes is that they avoid the trap that purist roguelikes often fall into. By having all this unlockable stuff, it gives players shorter-term goals to shoot for, so it's better at keeping players invested in the game. Reward structures are a tried and true means of getting players hooked. It's why clicker games are so addicting. Even something as simple as seeing a number increase can give you that dopamine hit, and unlocks and roguelikes can give you a taste of that without necessarily making the game inherently easier. Also, I feel that the addition of more gameplay variety adds to the inherent replay value. If you can change up your experience, it's like you have a new toy to play with. The novelty of something different can make you more excited to play the game. I think that variety roguelikes are solid, and they provide a nice challenging experience, but also one that can keep you playing, basically making them more bang for your buck. The super hardcore dedicated players may prefer purist roguelikes, and total newbies might still want actual upgrades, but it's something that I think can appeal to a lot of players, and it's definitely a popular way of making a roguelike. The last type of roguelike is one I like to call upgrade roguelikes. Here, any pretense of starting completely from scratch is scrapped, and the developers actually add a way for your character to be directly upgraded. Typically in these games, you collect some form of currency during your run, which you can then spend on upgrades before starting the next one. Games like Rogue Legacy and Undermine rely on this strategy, though the former uses it much more heavily than the latter. And Undermine also does this whole unlock variety thing as well, arguably to an even greater degree than the straight upgrades. I think the upsides to this philosophy are self-evident. For starters, it's far easier to get into, and it can make those initial few hours where you just suck so hard less frustrating. Sure, you may be getting your ass handed to you, but you're able to slowly power yourself up and work towards some smaller goals until you're skilled enough to seriously challenge the game. I find myself getting sucked into these games much faster than other roguelikes, and I also notice that because there are usually so many different things to unlock, I can get hardcore addicted, even if the core gameplay loop isn't necessarily my favorite. I mean, just look at Rogue Legacy's skill tree. That's so much shit to unlock that even though it takes me many tries before I can actually successfully kill a given boss, I'm not discouraged because I can still collect my goodies in between each run. Also, depending on each game's individual balance, these upgrades can have a bit of a placebo effect rather than an actual direct, serious power-up. Subconsciously, you may be thinking, oh, that upgrade is just what I need to push myself to the next level, when in actuality, the skill you gain and the time it takes to get that upgrade are much more impactful. And hell, by the time you've grinded out all the upgrades, you'll naturally get better at the game as well, so it almost masks that learning process by giving you a steady power trickle. The downsides, however, can be significant. The first is that balance is much more delicate. If you let the player power up too much, the game can become a bit of a breeze, and in a roguelike, that's a recipe for disaster. A big part of the charm of roguelikes is that you can keep coming back for a new and interesting challenge. Eliminate the challenge, and you've eliminated the main reason people play. Fortunately, many games realize that this is an issue and they take steps to resolve it. Many roguelikes, and not just upgrade roguelikes, now allow you to make the game a bit harder every time you beat it. This can be seen in Undermine's Summoning Stone, Rogue Legacy's New Game Plus, and Slay the Spire's Ascension. Point being, it's common to keep upping the difficulty. Once the player is able to cap it out after 20 or 30 successful runs, even if they quit afterwards, they still get some solid playtime out of it, more than enough to justify buying the game. Additionally, Undermine has a nice mechanic that they just added alongside the 1.0 release. There's an NPC that you unlock once you beat the game that can hex you. A hex basically acts as a customizable hard mode. You'll be saddled with some restriction that'll make the game harder. The one in particular that I think solves the problem of power creep in upgrades is Rogue's Ultimatum, which completely disables the upgrades. So basically, if you don't like how easy the upgrades have made the game, though it's still plenty challenging in my opinion, you have the option of playing without them, and that's pretty neat. Of course, there's other fun bits of bullshit you can get as well, like capping your health points at 1 or taking damage every time you collect gold. So the true masochists can have their brutally difficult game, even in an upgrade roguelike. But another downside that can come with this style of game is that the existence of upgrades can screw with the initial learning curve. Basically, the developer has to make the upgrades meaningful, but has to try to maintain a degree of challenge whether or not you have any particular upgrade. And as much as I've praised Undermine already, and as much as I do love the game, I do notice that the difficulty isn't always consistent. Now, I'm at the end game, and my current goal is to just keep beating the game in order to grind out the Summoning Stone, but also to grind out the variety unlocks that the game has to offer, which requires me to find recipes and an alternate currency. Almost invariably, the regular rooms and floors aren't very challenging. Sure, sometimes I'll take dumb damage, but I can pretty much always work my way through methodically and get to the boss stages 19 times out of 20. But the bosses themselves are a massive difficulty spike, more than bosses usually are. At times I feel like I'm just going to be spending a bunch of idle grind time to get to the actual challenge, which is not something I'm thrilled about. Also, the currency becomes kinda pointless once you actually get all the upgrades. Undermine kinda has the right idea about having the same currency work for permanent upgrades and for the temporary boosts that show up in shops, but they really didn't balance it for the end game. Once you have all the upgrades, there's no real gold sink, meaning you can just buy everything in every shop with zero resource management required. It kinda cheapens the whole point of a shop to me, which is that you need to determine if the cost of an item is worth it. When you can 100% afford literally everything, that aspect is gone. And again, that goes back to my point that upgrade roguelikes are hard to balance properly. And I don't think I've seen a game that actually completely nails it. I'm sure it exists, but I certainly haven't played it. Overall, upgrade roguelikes are a great way for people to be introduced to the genre, and they absolutely have that pull of consistent progression. But they won't likely appeal to hardcore roguelike fans at all, and I'm sure many players who find themselves really enjoying the genre end up gravitating more towards the variety or purist side of things. That being said, I do think these are the best for casual players, who as much as they get memed on, are an important facet to the gaming community and shouldn't be ignored. So overall, what do I personally think? Should roguelikes have permanent progression? Well, I think all the three philosophies I mentioned have their own value and fulfill a niche that people want. But personally, I find that I prefer my roguelikes to be heavy on the unlocks and variety, but light on the actual direct upgrades. That's of course not to say that I can't enjoy purist and upgrade roguelikes, but I find that variety offers everything that I personally enjoy about the genre. Plus, I can still get that hardcore challenge that you'd find in purist roguelikes without sacrificing the ability to work towards smaller goals, which I highly value in my games. But overall, I'd have to give the boring answer here. It all depends on what you, the player, truly enjoy. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. I upload every Monday, so make sure to check back in next week. Follow me on Twitter at AdsTweets for updates and memes, and follow me on Twitch at AdsGames if you want to hang out with me while I edit these videos. Once again, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next Monday.
Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back.